big meat is painting itself green. So if we can just jump to the first slide, if I can actually jump myself. Oh, here we go. So this can be a bit abstract, so I thought you might like to see some lobbying in action. These are two representatives. One is from Nutrien, that's one of the biggest fertilizer companies in the world. Ken Seitz, he came in with the Canada country delegation, which meant he had privileged access to the negotiations at the COP28 summit in Dubai. And he's talking to a lobbyist from the Dairy Export Council in the US, Nick Gardner. We were at COP, and I went to a panel that he was on. There were 26 CEOs, actually, from big agribusiness, took the time to go to COP, and their numbers doubled from last year. Meat and dairy, in particular, tripled their number of delegates. And they were there, in their words, to tell their story, to equip policymakers with their science, which makes you think what's wrong with everybody else's science, that you need to have your own. And to quote, as a counterbalance to NGOs who drown out the voices of rationality and reason in Europe. This is from an Australian representative. And Seitz's takeaway, which I think I got the feeling it wasn't the first time he'd said it, consumers won't pay extra for a net zero banana. So if that's the scope of your ambition as a company that makes something that is made out of fossil fuels, then that shows you that we have a problem. So, luckily, they have a comms plan, they're disciplined, they're powerful, they're well connected, and they're good at this. And they're doing everything they can to discredit and block green initiatives. But luckily, there are some people who are working to expose this, and we have the privilege of welcoming them to our panel today. Thin-Wei Lin is an award-winning multimedia journalist who specializes in food and climate issues, and she's the lead reporter on food systems for Lighthouse Reports. We have Clare to my left, who's a reporter and researcher who works with me at DeSmog. And Claire's work looks in depth at the lobbying and tactics of big ag, from the pesticide lobby to meat and dairy. And then we have Emile Frison, who's like the embodiment of the counterbalance to corporate Agri-spin. And he's a member of the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food System, IPES Food. He lives on a farm in Italy where he has an orchard, and he's also a senior advisor to the Agroecology Coalition. So, this is a whistle-stop tour, as I said before. We have 45 minutes, but we hope to break for some questions at the end. And now I will start with my questions. Oh, I will also say we've made a slide with all the reports and journalism that's referenced in this talk. I've put them all in a slide at the end with a tiny URL, so you'll be able to pick that up afterwards. Then. So what I hear a lot with these industrial groups, and I saw it in COP as well, is that they claim to speak for all farmers. You recently did a big investigation that got really to the heart of this, looking at COPA-COGECA, which claims to be the biggest farming union in Europe. Perhaps it is, perhaps it isn't. Would you like to tell us a little bit about what you found out about COPA-COGECA?
Sure, thanks, Hazel. Everybody can hear me, right? Great. Am I correct in assuming that you all know who COPA-COGECA is? Or no? Okay, sorry. I thought, farming conference. Okay, so COPA-COGECA is like the union of unions, right? So you have in the UK, the NFU. You've got in Ireland, you've got the Farmers Union. So the biggest national farmers unions in the EU are members of COPA-COGECA. So they're like the super union that represents farming associations and unions at Brussels. Of course, since Brexit, the NFU is no longer a member, but the NFU and the Ulster Members Union, Ulster Farmers Union, are listed as partner associations, so they still work quite closely. COPA is the oldest and most powerful, and in their own words, like Hazel said, the biggest farming union in Brussels. And they essentially say that they've always said that they represent more than 22 million farmers and their families in Europe, which is essentially almost the exact number of people in agriculture in Europe. So they're essentially saying they represent everybody who works in agriculture, right? And that number gives them legitimacy. they say that because they represent all of them, they are the arbiters of what farmers need and want, and that policymakers, bureaucrats, and other lobby groups should listen to them. And they do. They have a lot of influence and power. I mean, Claire looked at, the parliamentarians' connection and relationships with COPA and found that some of the very powerful members of parliament in the Agriculture Committee have very close relationship with COPA Cogeca. They have a lot of close relationships with the Commission, the Council. But what we have discovered in our 6 months investigation, where we spoke to more than 100 people, and we also did a survey with 50 members of COPA Cogeca, is that 22 million number is more aspirational than realistic. Even the Secretary General, Pekka Pesonen, essentially admitted to our media partner, Politico, one of the media partners for that investigation, that they actually don't represent 22 million farmers. But that is still on their website, yeah? And they still say that they represent all farmers. What we have found was that those numbers it's so hard to get into those numbers. They're opaque, unrealistic, unavailable, and unreliable. Just 3 quick examples. One, Romania has 2.9 million agriculture holdings. That's the largest in terms of agriculture holdings in Europe. COPA Cogeca members, Alliance of Four Unions, said repeatedly that they represent 3,500 farmers. Denmark has 1 COPA Cogeca member, and we were looking at the annual reports between, I think, 2016 and 2021, and we saw that they have seen an increase in farmers' members, and we're like, oh, this is curious, because that goes against the trend of both Europe and national level. So we were like, how did you manage to actually increase farmer members? They were like, oh, we cannot give you this information. And then they actually took out the number completely in their last report in 2022. Last one, Spain, has probably the most reliable data sets in, I think 6 countries that we looked at. But even then, the 3 members only represent 40% of farmers. So obviously, they do not represent all farmers, right? But that number, that legitimacy, gives them access to the corridors of power. Who they represent, what we found out based on interviews, including people who are members, are that they represent mainly the big, large-scale industrial agriculture. So a lot of farmers and cooperatives with a lot of land and engaging in intensive conventional agriculture. We also found out that in at least 3 countries, the governments were actually paying for their unions to be members of COPA. And that comes up to about 1.4 million euros annually. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of money to pay and hire people that can push and lobby for the kind of policies that will benefit the few that they represent, not the many that they say they represent or should be representing. And I think I'll wrap this up. I think that is the real danger, when there is a small group that represents a small subset of farmers, have such outsized power. The policies that they are pushing for, they're against all the farm to fork. They're against the Green Deal. They're against even the animal welfare laws. They're against nature restoration. They're against a lot of the policies that I think a lot of the farmers, agroecological principles, they're against, all of that. That really disenfranchises, has disenfranchised, and will continue to disenfranchise the kind of young, committed farmers that not just Europe, but the rest of the world needs to actually keep farming sustainable. And I think that's the real danger when you have that kind of, outsized power by a small group of unrepresentative power brokers.
Thanks, Lynn. And one of the things that really stayed with me about the investigation as well, that COPA Cogeca has talked openly about writing legislation on behalf of European policy-making institutions. So that just gives you a sense of their power. Claire, I'm going to turn to you. You've analysed some of the comms used by COPA Cogeca and others in Europe. Can you share, and globally, and can you share a little bit like their top 5 arguments that they use when they're kind of standing in the way of the kind of green transformations that we're interested in seeing in this audience, I suspect?
Yeah, for sure. So kind of alongside Copa Cogeca, the pesticide lobby is also extremely powerful in Europe. So since 2020, the 4 biggest pesticide firms, which are Bayer, BASF, Syngenta and Corteva, and their trade association CropLife Europe, have spent over 35 million euros lobbying Brussels. And in this time, they've had basically enormous wins. So for anyone who doesn't kind of know the European context, back in 2020, Europe first put forward this actually very progressive, as legislation goes, as government strategy goes, this progressive plan for sustainable agriculture. And it included some ambitious targets, so 20% fertilizer reductions, and also halving pesticide use, which obviously sent the pesticide lobby into absolute overdrive. And what we've seen is them kind of ally with other industrial farming groups like Copa Cogeca to really push out these pretty aggressive messages about what the targets would do. So, you know, I think these narratives are interesting, partly because they have won so much ground for the industry, but also partly because they're kind of narratives that are reflected by lots of different agribusiness organizations all over the world. So I think one of the first things that they've worked very hard to do, which we often see with agribusiness, is framing any proponents of the targets, people that they are opposed to, as kind of unreasonable, too radical, too woke, politically minded, in order to kind of discredit them and gain ground that way. And then, you know, on the other hand, pushing themselves forwards as the purveyors of science, of sound science, as they like to call it. And this is something that the pesticide industry does, again, world over, whether that's kind of funding lots of academic studies or even ghostwriting academic studies, as Monsanto did. But in this case, it was funding studies that looked at the impacts of the legislation. And by kind of tweaking the methodology, ensuring that the right parameters were used, these studies can come out with really pretty damning conclusions. So what the studies, there was a significant study done by paid for by CropLife Europe, and what that found was, if you put these targets in place, then it's going to destroy Europe's food production, which is obviously a very scary message, and seeds a huge amount of doubt within the EU. And with that, they're then able to say, this will make us incredibly dependent on imports. It will mean that we bring food in from places with lower environmental standards. Once they've kind of laid this ground, they've kind of created a lot of doubt in this area, they can then swoop in and put forward their own industry-friendly solutions, which are usually based on kind of high-tech innovations. So we're talking about things here like climate-smart agriculture, which, you know, arguably in some contexts can help gain some ground, but is reinforcing the monopoly of these companies, is giving them huge amounts of data and kind of re-embedding their own chemical-heavy products within the farming system.
Thanks, Claire. Emile, you come at this from a different perspective as someone who helps build up the case, the scientific case for agroecology and methods of farming, and a different vision. Are there any of those arguments that Claire has up there that particularly annoy you, or that you would like to unpick and disprove for me, that you're tired of hearing?
I think the general statement that an agroecological transformation of agriculture and food systems would not be able to feed the world, or Europe in particular, if we talk about Europe, is absolutely unfounded. And there is now sufficient evidence that this is not true, and evidence that is coming from all continents, from all scales. And I just want to illustrate a few here. 6 months ago, a major study was published about the agroecological transformation in Andhra Pradesh in India, where 1 million farmers, so we're not talking about one village or just a few farmers, this is about 1 million farmers, where a study looked at not only at productivity, but also at other dimensions, such as health, environment, etc., and which showed that comparing the farms that have moved to what they call natural farming, that's the name they use for agroecology, have 11% higher productivity than those that continue the chemical farming, 50% higher net income in average, but in addition, it has shown the impact it has on other factors, such as health. For example, 30% lower expenditure on health in households that were practicing agroecology compared to others. The same percentage of reduction of days off work because of sickness. And in addition to that, all the biodiversity and environmental impacts were equally speaking in favor of such a transformation. And I think what was, and I had the opportunity to visit Andhra Pradesh a couple of years ago, and what is really striking is to see not only these economic and other impacts, but the way that the farmers have been empowered and take control over their destiny by the accompaniment of building social capital that is an integral part of this transformation. And other very important dimension that I witnessed there is that a lot of land is being abandoned in Andhra Pradesh because of the lack of productivity resulting from the death of their soil that has been destroyed by the chemical inputs over years and years. And what I witnessed there is that going back to natural farming, within the first year, land that had been abandoned for 7 or 8 years because of not being productive anymore, was able to gain in the first year a decent yield again and bring back into production, and that was increasing year by year. So this is really, when we know that more than 1/3 of agricultural land is degraded or badly degraded, this is an important dimension as well. And this is not just in Asia, in India, or in Africa. This is valid everywhere. A couple of years ago, a study in Europe showed that in 9 different countries, in different types of production systems, dairy, cereal production, vegetable production, etc., that the net income was between 15 and 110% higher in agroecological farming compared to traditional farming. So this is valid. Now there is evidence about the performance, and the arguments that are still being used by lobbyists, by the industry, to say that this will be reducing productivity is absolutely unfounded.
So these are not the kind of arguments that we'll be hearing, you know, in the kind of networks that we've had a sense of now from Finn and Clare. Then could you give me a sense, could you talk a little bit more about the trade associations and the global networks and the ways in which this group and its associate kind of operates on a global level?
Sure, and I'll try and keep this short. So this is based on another investigation that we recently did, where we looked into this group called the European Livestock Voice. It was set up by 14 partner organizations, which represents all the livestock industries, so the animal breeders, the feed producers, but also the fur, the leather industry, as well as animal pharmaceuticals. It looks like trade associations, but if you dig deeper, obviously some of the biggest companies in these industries are part of these trade associations, and a lot of the UK, you know, meat processors associations and all the wholesalers, retailers are part of these as well. And we were looking into them because we got access to audio recordings and presentations that they made at an event last May in Virginia in the US, at an event at an annual summit by the Animal Agricultural Alliance. It's a non-profit that is very, very closely associated with the US meat and dairy industry, the big ag, essentially, where the campaign manager for ELV, this guy called Andrea Battaglio, essentially was saying, oh, you know, I've been an environmental journalist for 18 years, but now my role is to tell the people about livestock. and said that their target is the Brussels bubble and their target is the animal welfare laws. So there was, just very briefly, there was a big push a couple of years ago by 1.4 million citizens in Europe asking to end the practice of keeping farm animals in cages. And that was one of the part of the animal welfare laws that was supposed to come up last summer. Came and went, and it got dropped. Only 1 out of 4 laws survived. And one of the things that we discovered in the process of the investigation was that they attacked science, like Hazel was saying. They really attacked, both Claire and Hazel have said, they really attacked the science from EFSA and from others that said that, farm animals are sentient beings and they should be treated this way, and they're like, oh, this is going to cost too much, this science is political, it's not real science. And in fact, one of the documents that we got from FOIA request actually said that please don't listen to the NGOs because they don't represent the people. And sorry, going back to the US connection, in that same Animal Agriculture Alliance event, there was also a speaker called Jack Herbert, who actually is an owner and partner of this PR company called Berman & Co. They're well known for their attack ads against journalists, scientists, environmentalists, and animal rights activists. And he was sharing how they've been organizing attacks against groups, organizations like the Humane Society for Animals. And they're moving the debate away from animal welfare, from migrant workers' rights, from environment, into the individual organizations and how they're perhaps, misusing the taxpayers' monies, etc. And at the end of it, the campaign manager for ELV stood up and said, you know what, I want to bring something similar to Europe. I want to talk to you. So we were like, hang on, what is going on? And we had an interview at length with the campaign manager who sort of said that, oh, it was a joke, and I'm not doing this, and I haven't brought it to ELV. We're not doing this. But and we haven't been able to find evidence of it, but it does show the fact that these networks are global, and we're fighting a very well networked group of spinners.
Thanks for bringing us nicely back to the title of the session. That was good. I think one of the things that is disturbing about these trade associations as well is that you can, Bayer as a pesticide company can keep fairly quiet, but CropLife, which it's a member of, can be very outspoken. So it's ways the companies can, be part of lobby associations with aggressive positions and avoid saying aggressive things themselves. So it's a useful part of the playbook. And I wondered, Claire, if you could add to that, because I think one of the disturbing things about how Big Ag operates, and I alluded to it at the beginning, is that it's following a formula that we've seen in other industries, tobacco, fossil fuels. So could you give us just a sense of a sort of behind-the-scenes look into the mechanics of how they go about constructing these narratives and seeding doubt?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I touched on this a little bit before, but I think there is very much a step-by-step process which starts with creating industry-friendly evidence, funding studies. They put so much money into academia that they can direct what's looked at and also what is ignored. And then from that, seeding this doubt in the way that we've seen the tobacco industry and the fossil fuel industry do, I think lobbyists and PR firms have realized that you don't have to come all out against something these days. If you create enough disruption of something that is actually has quite wide scientific consensus around it, then it opens a discussion and sort of slows down legislation to the point where it may not go through. And then you can roll out these huge strategic communication plans. I think, so I've obviously talked about the pesticide example, but a similar formula has been followed by the chemicals industry, it's been followed by the packaging industry, it's been followed by airlines for all these different green legislations since 2020 that have been going through in Europe. One example that we've been looking at that's been very interesting is, so around packaging, the EU tried to move towards reusable packaging, and it totally freaked out a number of industries, including the fast food industry, because it would completely disrupt their model of kind of quick disposal, quick turnaround. So McDonald's funded one of these studies, and then it put a huge amount of money behind pushing it out. So what you can see on the screen, you know, this is a billboard in an airport in Brussels, but they were also in train stations all over Brussels as well. It's a leaflet that was delivered to an MEP I spoke to. Lobbyists, we don't know who, but lobbyists even went into Parliament after hours when they weren't supposed to be there to hang up these flyers in toilets and bars and cafes to make sure that MEPs were seeing this messaging around how dangerous reusable packaging was. And I think this really just shows one of their key tactics, I think, is just sheer volume. You know, they can out-money civil society organizations or smallholder farmers or campaigners very easily. So they just make sure that there is an enormous volume of their messaging. One of the things that we do at DeSmog is spend time kind of mapping these sort of routes to influence. And we've been doing this for the last few COPs in terms of big ag. So this is a map of kind of some of the big agri players who are at COP28 and some of the routes to access that they had. And hopefully it just shows you, again, the sheer volume of ways in which they're trying to influence conversation and control the tone of discussion at these events.
I'm not sure if they went. Are they on there?
I don't think they're on there themselves, but they attended through the World Farmers Organization, which is obviously a bit of a tricky player. Because it...
Maybe start that answer again.
Starting again for the microphone. So they did attend, but they attended through the World Farmers Organization, who is one of the groups that we struggle to categorize because they represent everyone from kind of very big ag, and then some of the people who were attending with them were smallholders. So we didn't kind of come out all out and say these are big ag lobbyists, but we have an eye on people like Copa Cogeca who are at these events.
So just to pick up on Claire's map, Emile, I'm interested to know, so that these groups are well networked, they're powerful, they have access to policymakers. Do you think policymakers are convinced by their arguments? Do they see through them? What are the effects, the impact on public policy of this lobbying operation?
I'm afraid that in many cases they do believe, and mainly because that's the main message they are hearing. A lot of the policymakers are not specialists in the field they are supposed to be controlling. I mean, a minister of agriculture, for example, in most cases would not have a background in agriculture. And I just give one concrete example. A few years ago, I was invited to meet senators and members of parliament in Canada to talk about the need for food system transformation and the role of agroecology in doing that. And one of the senators that I met was the chair of the Agriculture Committee. And she was very happy to meet with me, and we engaged a conversation, and she said, "Oh, that's interesting. Yesterday I had the visit of somebody from the Fertilizer Institute who showed us strong evidence that unless we radically increase fertilizer in developing countries, there will be mass starvation in the future, and Canada has an important role to play in making sure that these farmers have access to fertilizers, etc." And then I told my story, and she said, "Well, I'm really happy you came, because so far I had only heard the story about the need for more fertilizers." And so what I want to get out of that is really the power that these companies have, the investment they are making. We heard the figure of 30 million being lobbying. The pesticide company in the US is $150 million a year. $150 million a year in lobbying. That is very difficult to counter by having people coming from a different background, from scientists that are not paid by the companies or by civil society organizations. it's very difficult to compete with that. But that's what we are confronting. And if people only hear the message from the Fertilizer Institute, which is just the lobbying arm of the fertilizer companies, then in many cases they will be believed. So there is a really unlevel playing field that we have to be aware of and try to do what we can to get the right information to the right people.
Thank you. Yeah, I've noticed, I think from memory, Canada brought 6 representatives from fertilizer companies in their country delegations COP. So they clearly, with their cereal crops, have a big connection there. That has brought us, amazingly, to 11 minutes left for questions. So I want to open up at this point and remind people, don't speak until you have the mic for the benefit of the online audience so they can hear your full question. We're going to take the first question from the room and the second question from online. Do we have any questions for the panel? Somebody right here.
Hello, thank you. I'm a local farmer and I think it's wonderful the work you do. And I'd just like to say about the NFU, the reason I'm a member of them, I thought about giving it up, but my insurance for the farm is all linked through that, and actually it saves you a lot of money being part of it. So it sort of feels financially risky to abandon it and then not be insured by a company that understands farms. Is there a solution to that? I mean, that is a massive, and I'm absolutely horrified that they then are linked to this dreadful organisation that stops green things happening in Brussels.
Thanks for your question. Yeah, I think often big corporations do, and powerful unions linked to corporations do offer very useful services to farmers, and you see that across the global south as well. Emile, would you like to take that question?
Well, I only know another bad example on how some of the unions are in a very difficult situation to actually promote the change. I'm originally from Belgium, and the largest farmer association in Belgium is called Boerenbond. They also have one arm that is selling inputs to farmers. So the more money they make from selling the inputs, that's actually their major source of income. So it's very difficult to be advocating for change and advising farmers about alternative ways of doing agriculture if they have a strong interest in the business that is their main source of income. So I think there have to be really radical changes in having independent advice given to farmers if we want to really have change.
Maybe just very briefly, I mean, yours is, not an exception. In France, FNSEA, in many other countries as well, that some of the largest national unions have such a strong stranglehold on, for example, distributing the CAP subsidies, for example, it goes through them. So farmers are locked in, unfortunately, the system. They want to get out, but they cannot. There are alternative groups, obviously, like La Via Campesina, and IFOAM and others, but they don't have the same power and access. And the question is, of course, how can we help make it a more level playing field so that agricultural policy making is not just in the hands of a few, and therefore farmers will also have the opportunity to be able to choose and belong to groups that they actually share the same values with, right? But unfortunately, it's a long-term problem.
Thanks. If we can take the online question now, thank you.
Yes, we have 180 people joining online and quite a few questions in the chat. But one, I think it's quite constructive. It comes from Diana Smith. Politicians often have alarmingly little knowledge of the systems they're supposed to be creating policy for. This makes them so vulnerable to well-organized lobbyists. So the question is, how can we be heard as a movement?
Well, I think by really organizing ourselves to engage with the policymakers, I think there's been sometimes a tendency to say, well, it's a lost case, they won't listen to us, etc. I think a lot of the lobbying that is, or the people that are being lobbied don't necessarily be in bed with industry. Sometimes this is just the only voice they hear. And so engaging with them in a constructive way, I think is really the way to change that. In some cases, there will be corruption, etc. But I think we must really engage with the policymakers if we want things to change.
Yes, I also met representatives of small farming organisations in COP who said, you know, we have to be here because if we're not, they're the only show in town. And they were finding that as part of a farmers' constituency in Dubai, they were able to, via Campesina, were able to block the proposals from the NFU type organisations from the other side. It's kind of stalemate. So if they hadn't been there, the proposals going through to for negotiations would have been one-sided. So I do think there is something about being in the room, however demoralising it may sometimes feel. There was someone who kept his hand up for a really long time just there, so I'm going to reward him with a question. Yeah.
Cheers, thank you very much. So before I ask the question which I was going to ask, if I can just pick up on the first question about the NFU insurance, speaking as somebody who in my less enlightened youth used to work for the NFU, so just to confirm on that, so just to clarify that point, the NFU is a completely separate organisation from the NFU Mutual, the insurance business. They are two separate organisations with a close working relationship, and they have a very close engagement at the local level, but structurally they are two separate organisations. You don't have to be a member of the NFU to take advantage of NFU Mutual farm insurance. So fair enough. Yeah, sure. Okay. Well, so the actual point I wanted to make in this, so it was something I saw in an article this morning. I just happened to be looking at in Farmers Weekly, and it's not so much about the lobbying organisations, which are very much trade associations, whether it's for big agricultural businesses or pesticide or fertiliser industry businesses, but it's about these perhaps slightly more opaque organisations. The one I was reading about this morning was called Science for Sustainable Agriculture. I suspect there are numerous such organisations which are perhaps present themselves as independent think tank type organisations. You look at some of the individuals behind them and what their interests are, but there's very little information about, for instance, their funding. And I'd just be interested in your perspectives on those kind of organisations, which, yeah, thank you.
I'll give that to you, Claire. Do you want to take that question? Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, there's a huge number of organisations like that. Like another one that comes to mind in the UK is the Genetic Literacy Project, which is part funded by Bayer. We call them AstroTurf groups, so campaigns that look like they're led by consumers or concerned citizens, but in fact have some kind of corporate backing. There was a really interesting example a few years ago I think it was in Ireland, where there was a campaign set up that looked like it was concerned farmers, and it was actually defending livestock, and it was actually set up by Red Flag, which is a PR firm that represents the livestock industry and very big livestock players. So I think this is something, yeah, we see a fair amount of, and we are always trying to get to the bottom of. There are often warning signs, you know, when an organisation like that doesn't necessarily say kind of who's behind it or how it was formed by citizens. It just says, we are a citizens group. Then we will start doing some digging and have some healthy scepticism, I think.
Did you want to weigh in on that, or do you have anything to add? You're happy? Okay, great. Should we take another online question? Oh, did you want to add to that, Emile? No, you're okay. Okay, one more from the audience. Back.
And this,
Does it work? Oh, yeah. Hi, thank you. And thanks for the super interesting talk. And also, I thought it was really important what was pointed out here in the audience, how the insurances can kind of keep farmers locked into particular relationships, but even beyond that, financial institutions and banks really have a big stronghold on farmers and make it almost impossible for them to make certain decisions. And often the advisors in the banks are also not educated. So I was wondering whether any of you have already done some looking into how the people making decisions in banks as to what kind of loans can be passed on and so forth can be given to farms, how they are educated. Because I think there is also a lobby question there that is sort of a bit less looked at, because it's not about politics, but actually in terms of transformation and transition, banks play a massive role. Thank you.
I know that in some countries in Africa, there have been efforts to educate people in banks about agroecology, about the downsides of and the lack of sustainability of industrial agriculture. And so I think it's a very important point, because again, it's out of ignorance that a lot of the wrong decisions are taken. But this is again a case where engagement should be made with decision makers in banks to educate them. And I think that's maybe a role for some of the civil society organizations as well.
I'm also aware of various campaigns which are targeting banks that invest in industrial agriculture. So I think Rabobank is one of the big ones that is coming under fire. So campaigners are kind of coming at it from the opposite direction to put pressure on those investors to reconsider where they put their money. Would we have time for one? Oh, we're at time. No more questions. Okay. So I'll just to quickly wrap up. Thank you so much for coming today and for your engagement. Hopefully you've got a sense of what we're up against. We also, we know that the claim that agroecology decreases yields is not true or not necessarily true. And we've got a call to equip our policymakers with the right evidence. Thanks, everybody.